In Renaissance Florence, a city bursting with art and beauty, one man's influence would turn paradise into a nightmare. That man was Girolamo Savonarola, who ruled the magnificent city with strict religious fervor. It's hard to imagine that the same crowds who once revered him later called for his downfall. When power relies on fear and extreme beliefs, it rarely lasts, and when it collapses, the consequences can be severe. On May 23, 1498, the sun rose over Florence's Piazza della Signoria, where thousands gathered, not to celebrate, but to bear witness to Savonarola's end. The prophet who once commanded their souls was now facing the flames he had used to destroy countless works of art, books, and dreams. The crowd that had once hung on his every word now craved his cries for mercy. This moment wasn't just about one man's execution. It serves as a powerful reminder of how unchecked power can corrupt, how fear can be used to control the masses, and how those who preach intolerance often meet a violent end. Savonarola's rise and fall illustrates a stark lesson. History's most dangerous figures sometimes appear righteous, claiming to offer salvation while spreading despair. Florence, during the late 15th century, was a place straddling two realities. On one hand, the Renaissance had turned it into Europe's cultural centerpiece, thanks to the Medici family's support of art, literature, and humanism. Lorenzo de' Medici, often called Lorenzo the Magnificent, had made Florence a city admired worldwide. Artists like Michelangelo transformed marble into lifelike figures, and Botticelli painted ethereal scenes like Venus rising from the sea. Scholars revived the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome, marking an era of growth and creativity. Yet beneath this bright surface, darker issues simmered. The Catholic Church was riddled with corruption. Pope Alexander VI, known as Rodrigo Borgia, openly flaunted his affairs and sold church positions to the highest bidder. Many devout Christians felt betrayed by the very institution meant to uphold their faith. While the common people were surrounded by artistic beauty, they grappled with poverty and disease, searching for a deeper spiritual connection. In a world filled with complexity and uncertainty, a unique leader emerged, Girolamo Savonarola. He was a Dominican friar who stood firm against corruption, permeating every level of society. Born in Ferrara in 1452, his early life was marked by disappointment, especially after being denied the woman he loved, a rejection that drove him to seek solace in the church. Savonarola's initial efforts as a preacher were not met with success. Accounts from that time describe him as awkward, with a harsh delivery that often alienated potential followers. However, repeated rejection shaped him into a man of strong conviction. He saw the world as sinful and refused to compromise his beliefs. The real change occurred in 1490, when he returned to Florence and began preaching at the convent of San Marco. It was clear that something had transformed within him during his years of struggle. His once faltering sermons now brimmed with passion and urgency. Savonarola claimed that God had revealed to him profound visions of divine punishment that awaited Italy. He spoke fervently against the corruption of the church and the arrogance typical of Renaissance culture, asserting that these sins had earned humanity the wrath of heaven. As he thundered from the pulpit, he vividly described the dire consequences of unrepentance: bloodshed invading armies from the north, and divine judgment that would divide the righteous from the damned. What set Savonarola apart was not just the fire in his words, but their seeming accuracy. In 1494, just as he had warned, French armies led by Charles VII invaded Italy, easily overpowering all opposition. The Medici family, who had long ruled Florence, fled in a panic as their political system crumbled almost overnight. To the frightened citizens of Florence, it seemed as though Savonarola's predictions were unfolding with alarming precision. Here was a man who had anticipated what even seasoned political analysts and military strategists failed to see. If he could foresee such an invasion, what further insights might he have into God's intentions for their city? Following the Medici's departure, a vacuum of power arose, and Savonarola swiftly filled it with his ever-growing band of supporters. What began as a religious revival soon morphed into a theocratic regime that would be far more severe than the Spanish Inquisition. Savonarola boldly claimed that Christ himself was now present among them. In Florence, the influence of Savonarola was profound as he positioned himself as the king's earthly representative. This wasn't just a figurehead role. Savonarola had substantial political authority. He advised the newly formed Republican government and sought to reshape Florentine society based on his strict interpretation of Christian teachings. The changes he initiated were swift and unsettling. Once celebrated as Europe's cultural hub, Florence increasingly resembled a police state. Citizens faced the constant worry of being reported for their actions, with informants present at every corner. Savonarola even mobilized children to act as religious enforcers, forming groups that patrolled the streets. These youngsters searched homes for anything considered vain or sinful, such as cosmetics, jewelry, fine clothing, secular literature, musical instruments, and artwork, all branded as targets for destruction. Imagine being just 8 years old and holding the power to ruin someone's life with a mere accusation. This is the reality under Savonarola's increasingly oppressive regime. Perhaps the most notorious event symbolizing this fanaticism was the bonfires of the Vanities. These public burnings took place in the piazza, where citizens were compelled to surrender their belongings to the flames. Priceless manuscripts, irreplaceable artworks, and centuries of cultural heritage were consumed, rising in smoke as Savonarola's followers sang hymns celebrating the destruction. Even the artist Botticelli was swept up in this fervor, choosing to throw some of his own works into the fire. Ironically, the city that birthed the Renaissance was now dismantling the very culture that defined its greatness. However, it wasn't just objects that were destroyed in this environment. Human lives were also affected by the fervor of fanaticism. Savonarola's sermons grew increasingly aggressive, calling for the punishment of sodomites, heretics, and anyone daring to challenge his authority. He built a network of spies that turned friends into foes and strained family relationships, leading to public floggings and the looming threat of execution for those who didn't show enough devotion. The city's sex workers were forced out, artists were silenced, and intellectuals had to choose between fleeing or bending to oppression. The psychological toll on the people of Florence was devastating. A culture that once celebrated human achievement and individual expression found itself replaced by fear and conformity. The very essence of what had made Florence a beacon of creativity and thought was under siege, marking a dark chapter in its history. In a society where conformity and self-denial were expected, citizens moved through the streets with their heads down, hesitant to show any hint of joy or success that might be seen as sinful pride. Laughter was viewed with suspicion, beauty was considered a temptation, and the pursuit of knowledge was met with skepticism unless it aligned with religious teachings. The vibrant spirit of the Renaissance, which had transformed Florence into a cultural wonder, was being stifled by a figure who claimed to represent God. As Savonarola tightened his grip on Florence, his growing influence began to create friction with Pope Alexander VI. Initially, the Pope tolerated Savonarola's reforms, but the friar's critiques of church corruption became more personal. Savonarola didn't shy away from hinting at the Pope's own moral shortcomings. When he declared that Alexander VI was not the true Pope and demanded a council to remove him, he crossed a critical line. The Pope quickly responded by issuing a papal bull in May 1497, which excommunicated Savonarola and imposed an interdict on Florence, a spiritual blockade cutting the city's citizens off from the sacraments, putting their salvation at risk. This act was designed to incite doubt among the people. If Savonarola spoke for God, why had the Pope cast him out? Doubts blossomed rapidly among the populace. Savonarola's reaction to his excommunication showcased his delusions of grandeur. Instead of seeking peace or showing humility, he labeled the Pope as the Antichrist, and claimed that the excommunication was invalid. He continued to hold Mass despite the ban and urged his followers to disregard the interdict. To his staunch supporters, this defiance may have appeared brave, but to many in Florence, it seemed like the erratic behavior of a man whose pride overshadowed reason. How could someone professing to serve God boldly challenge the head of the church established by Christ? As pressures, both political and religious, mounted against him, Savonarola made frantic efforts to assert his divine authority. By April 1498, he agreed to undergo a trial by ordeal, in a last-ditch effort to prove his legitimacy and reconnect with his followers. In a moment that was intended to showcase his faith, Savonarola faced a trial by fire, a dramatic test meant to reveal God's favor. If he could walk through the flames unscathed, it would serve as evidence that his mission had heaven's support. The city gathered in the Piazza della Signoria, eager to witness this spectacle. However, when the time came, Savonarola hesitated and decided not to enter the fire. His followers quickly offered excuses, claiming that rain had ruined the wood and suggesting a delay. Yet the impact on his reputation was unmistakable. This failure was a turning point for Savonarola's theocracy. The man who had demanded unwavering faith from his followers had revealed that his own faith had boundaries. Rather than witnessing a miraculous event, the crowd saw a leader who shirked the dangers he had asked others to face. Disappointment bubbled to the surface as the people of Florence began to question the very foundations of what Savonarola had taught them. And just a few days after the failed trial, public sentiment shifted sharply against Savonarola and his supporters. Freed from the grip of fear, the citizens began to recall their losses during his rule. They remembered the rich artworks that had been destroyed, the books that had been burned, and the lives shattered by violence or exile. The vibrant Renaissance culture that had made them proud was buried beneath the oppressive fear instilled by a man who thrived on intimidation. On April 8, 1498, a furious mob surrounded the convent of San Marco, the refuge Savonarola had sought. What was once his stronghold now turned into a prison as hundreds demanded his surrender. When his supporters attempted to protect him, chaos erupted in the streets. Outnumbered and overwhelmed, they could not hold back the crowd. After hours of violence, the convent doors were breached. Savonarola was pulled from his hiding place by the very people who had once regarded him with reverence. The man who emerged from San Marco was a stark contrast to the imposing figure who had once held sway over Florence. Years of absolute power had aged him significantly, and now he appeared frail and confused. Gone was the fiery conviction that had once fueled his sermons. As he was handed over to secular authorities, the prophet who claimed to possess divine insight appeared to be a shadow of his former self. There was once a middle-aged man who found himself ensnared by the very lies he had spun. This man, a figure of authority, was not just facing arrest. He was confronted by a populace that had long suffered under a regime of fear. The city sought not just a simple arrest, it wanted answers, and the harsh methods that had been used against others in his name would now be turned back upon him, as the man who had once sent countless people to endure the worst torments now faced his own fate. He learned that the same techniques he had approved for extracting confessions could also be applied to himself. The ordeal began right after his capture, in the basement of the Palazzo Veio, under the watchful eyes of both civil and church leaders. They chose a method known as the strappado, a device that had been honed during previous times of turmoil and was notorious for breaking the strongest of wills. Picture this: his hands were tied behind his back and affixed to a rope that ran over a pulley. Then he was hoisted into the air, with his body weight tugging painfully at his shoulders, which were never meant to endure such stress. The initial lift brought excruciating pain as the joints threatened to give way, but the true horror lay in what came next. The torturer would suddenly release the rope, sending him plummeting several feet before coming to a violent halt. The sounds of bones cracking and tissues tearing echoed through the chamber as each drop inflicted unbearable pain. gradually dislocating his shoulders and sending waves of agony through his entire body. Witnesses later recounted hearing his screams resonate throughout the palace. This torture was relentless, lasting hour after hour, day after day. The man who had once preached the cleansing power of suffering was now intimately familiar with the agony he had imposed on others. Those tasked with his torture, many of whom had seen their own friends and family torn apart by his tyranny, showed little mercy as they employed the very techniques he had once championed. Between each session on the rack, he was returned to a cramped cell, barely big enough for him to lie down. There, the risk of infection and fever from his injuries compounded his misery. Psychological torment perhaps surpassed the physical pain, for he had crafted his entire identity around a claim of divine insight. How must it feel to have that identity unravel before him, piece by piece? His unwavering belief that God was speaking through him started to falter as the torture continued without any sign of divine help. He began to question where the God who had chosen him as a prophet was. Why were his prayers for salvation going unanswered? The silence from above proved to be more crushing than any physical pain he endured. After 2 weeks of relentless torment, Savonarola's body and spirit were shattered. His arms hung limply at his sides, contorted into unnatural angles, and his once commanding voice had dwindled to a faint whisper. Perhaps most devastating of all was the collapse of his faith, which had been the cornerstone of his life. The confession he ultimately signed acknowledged that his visions were false. His prophecies emerged from his own ambitions, and he had misled Florence for his own glory. Yet this humiliating admission did little to quell the thirst for retribution that had built up during his rule. The people of Florence were not satisfied with mere imprisonment or exile. They craved a more dramatic form of justice. The city demanded blood and insisted it be delivered in a public and humiliating manner. Savonarola was to meet his end in the very square where he had presided over bonfires, where he had orchestrated the destruction of art and culture. The flames that once consumed masterpieces would now consume the man responsible for their loss. The execution was set for May 23rd, 1448, allowing time for the city to prepare a spectacle befitting the occasion. Carpenters constructed a massive platform in the center of the Piazza della Signoria, tall enough to be seen from every corner. A gallows was built, while workers beneath it stacked wood and kindling, ready for a fire hot enough to erase all evidence of Girolamo Savonarola's existence. This would not be a swift death, but rather a prolonged agony, intended as both entertainment for the crowd and a warning to any future tyrants. As word of the impending execution spread across Tuscany, people flocked to Florence from hundreds of miles away, not out of sympathy for Savonarola, but out of sheer curiosity to witness the downfall of a man who had once held such formidable power. Merchants shuttered their shops, farmers left their crops unattended, and nobles abandoned their palaces to bear witness to this decisive moment in history. Dawn broke on the day of execution, and the piazza in Florence was filled with people, a vast sea of faces eager to witness what they believed would be justice. The atmosphere felt more like a lively festival than a solemn ceremony. Vendors sold food and wine, laughter mingling with the noise, while in the crowd, pickpockets and defiant women, whom Savonarola had once driven from the city, resumed their trades openly. Children who had once been his loyal enforcers hurled stones and shouted insults at the platform where he would meet his fate. After 4 long years of fear, the city was celebrating its newfound freedom, though this joyous occasion would also mark the end of the man who had stolen their happiness. As the prison doors swung open at dawn, out stepped a figure far removed from the commanding leader who once ruled Florence. Savonarola had to be carried. His body, battered and broken, could not stand on its own. His arms hung awkwardly, clearly injured, and his once fiery face was now a painful gray, etched with despair. Most startling was his silence. The man who had once proclaimed his ideas with a booming voice could now barely communicate, whether due to injury or a deeper psychological breakdown. The procession towards the scaffold was intentionally slow, allowing the crowd ample time to express their anger at the man who had once held them in fear. Guards formed a protective line around him as onlookers surged forward to spit, strike with sticks, and hurl the most hateful insults imaginable. Some threw rotten fruit and animal waste, while others simply yelled until their voices gave out. This wasn't the noble procession of a martyr. It was a shameful display of a tyrant facing the consequences of his own actions. When they reached the scaffold, Savonarola was stripped of his simple brown robe, leaving him exposed before the very crowd that used to revere him. This act of humiliation aimed to strip away any remaining dignity he might have had, revealing him simply as a fragile human being. The man who had preached against physical beauty and promoted modesty now stood vulnerable, a stark reminder that even those who seem powerful can crumble in the face of justice. A striking example of a fate he had once dismissed, the execution was meticulously orchestrated to combine various forms of death in a way that maximized suffering. Savonarola faced hanging, but it was designed to be just long enough to bring him to the edge of consciousness without actually allowing him to die. After moments of torment, he would be revived, only to be hanged again. This cycle continued until his tormentors decided he had experienced enough pain. Then, to intensify the horror, they set fire beneath him, guaranteeing he would remain aware during the dreadful act of being burned alive. This was not merely an execution. It was a carefully constructed spectacle intended to satisfy the crowd's desire for vengeance. As the rope was placed around Savonarola's neck, he tried to speak, perhaps to pray or to assert his innocence one last time. Unfortunately, his voice was drowned out by the overwhelming noise of the crowd, a mix of jeers and cheers as the executioner readied himself. The man who once commanded silence, with a mere gesture, could not be heard above the cacophony from those he had once instilled fear in. Even in his final moments, he was denied the dignity he had taken from others. The first hanging was brief, just enough to show the executioner's power over life and death. Savonarola's body jerked and twisted at the end of the rope, his face turning purple and his eyes bulging. The crowd cheered as he lost consciousness, but their celebration was premature. This was just the start of his nightmare. When he was lowered and revived, the agony began anew, drawing screams from him and fresh approval from the onlookers. After the third hanging, with Savonarola barely clinging to consciousness and convulsing, the executioners finally turned to the torches, igniting the kindling stacked beneath the scaffold. The flames caught quickly, fueled by the dry wood and pitch prepared for maximum intensity. As the fire climbed toward the platform, the crowd leaned in, eager to witness every moment of their former tyrant's last moments. This was the climax of a lengthy plan, the moment when Florence would finally rid itself of the man who had shackled it in fear and fanaticism. The initial pleasant scent of burning wood quickly transformed into something far more horrifying as the flames reached Savonarola's feet. As the flames began to consume his flesh, the sounds of his weak screams mingled with the crackling fire and the cheers of the crowd. Those closest to the scaffold later claimed he appeared to be trying to pray. His lips moved, possibly uttering the same psalms he had once used to instill fear in others. Yet, if God was listening to those final prayers, he chose not to step in. The fire raged for hours, engulfing not just Savonarola, but also the wooden platform and any remnants of Gibet. The crowd stayed, unwilling to leave until they confirmed that nothing was left of the man who had tormented them. Children were hoisted onto their parents' shoulders for a better view, while women who had been forced to burn their cosmetics and jewelry during his reign watched with satisfaction as he faced the same flames they believed were a form of justice. When the fire finally reduced to glowing coals, the authorities made one last move to ensure Savonarola could never return to haunt Florence. They carefully collected his ashes and any remaining bone fragments, casting them into the Arno River, the very waterway that had once carried away the remains from his bonfires of vanities. This was more than just the disposal of remains. It was a calculated effort to prevent his followers from claiming him as a martyr. Even in death, the authorities feared his ability to inspire fervor. As the sun set over Florence, the crowd began to disperse, but the celebration continued in taverns and homes throughout the city. For the first time in years, citizens felt free to laugh and sing, to appreciate beauty without the threat of denunciation. The psychological shackles that had bound them for so long were shattered, just like their tormentor's body. Artists re-emerged from hiding, ready to create anew, while scholars dared to read forbidden texts. Ordinary people embraced the simple joys that make life worthwhile. However, the story of Girolamo Savonarola's rise and fall offers lessons that go beyond the borders of Renaissance Florence. His transformation from a failed preacher to an absolute ruler highlights how charismatic leaders can manipulate fear and uncertainty to seize power, even over a population that is educated and sophisticated. Florence was once a vibrant cultural hub, yet the people chose to give up their freedom to a leader who assured them security and salvation in return for their obedience. The rapid shift towards Savonarola's theocracy should remind us of what can happen in societies that cherish freedom and tolerance. Within just a few months of gaining influence, he turned Florence from a beacon of artistic expression into a fear-based police state. Imagine a place where children reported on their parents and neighbors lived in a constant state of anxiety. The systems that once safeguarded Florentine liberties, the guilds, the Republican government, and the various checks and balances that prevented any one person from amassing too much power, proved ineffective against a leader who claimed to speak for a higher authority. What's perhaps most alarming is how quickly the public adapted to their grim new reality. People who had enjoyed freedom for most of their lives came to accept surveillance, censorship, and the threat of violence as ordinary parts of life. They persuaded themselves that their burdens were justified, believing that the dismantling of their culture was vital for their spiritual salvation. This uneasy compliance illustrates how even well-meaning people can be led astray when they relinquish their personal judgment to a charismatic figure. Savonarola employed various psychological tactics to gain control. By fostering an atmosphere of ongoing crisis, painting outsiders as enemies, and demanding unwavering loyalty to himself over abstract principles. He mirrored strategies used by dictators throughout history. From the Spanish Inquisition to contemporary authoritarian regimes, the trends are strikingly similar. Leaders gaining power by asserting they possess unique insights into divine will or historical destiny often justify harsh actions against those they view as threats. Another unsettling aspect of Savonarola's regime was how he mobilized children. By organizing them into groups of enforcers and encouraging them to spy on their own families, he dismantled the essential trust that holds societies together. When children can't trust their parents and parents live in fear of their children, the family unit, a cornerstone against state oppression, turns into a mechanism of control rather than a source of refuge. The impact on art and culture in this environment is profound, leading to a broader examination of how societies navigate the delicate balance between freedom and security. The culture during the bonfires of the vanities illustrates more than just sheer fanaticism. It represents a calculated assault on the very essence of the human spirit. Throughout history, tyrants have recognized that beauty, creativity, and independent thought are significant threats to their power. By dismantling the cultural achievements that instill pride in a civilization, authoritarian leaders weaken individuals, making them more reliant on promises that only the leader can fulfill. However, the downfall of Savonarola sheds light on the vulnerabilities of power sustained by fear and deception. His claims of divine authority depended on the unwavering belief of his followers. This belief wavered when the Pope excommunicated him and he failed in his trial by fire, leading to a rapid collapse of his control. The same crowds that once revered him quickly turned against him in anger upon realizing they had been misled. The brutality of Savonarola's execution may seem shocking today, but it mirrored the medieval view of justice as a public spectacle intended to restore social order. The people of Florence believed that only through his public suffering could they balance the wrongs he had committed against their city. From their perspective, the man who had instilled fear for years rightfully deserved to experience the same pain he had inflicted on others. The intensity of his torture and execution aimed to serve as both punishment and a deterrent. Many today might question whether such extreme retaliation was justified, regardless of Savonarola's actions. The torture that shattered his body and spirit, the intentional prolonging of his agony, and the careful crafting of his public humiliation all provoke unsettling questions about justice and the limits of punishment. Yet, it's essential to remember that the Florentines saw themselves as victims of a tyrant who had robbed them of precious years and destroyed invaluable cultural treasures. In the wake of Savonarola's death, Florence quickly began to flourish once more. Artists who had shelved their brushes during the years of theocratic rule re-emerged, producing some of the most iconic masterpieces of the Renaissance. Scholars returned to their studies of classical texts, and merchants reopened their businesses. The resilience of culture and creativity in the face of tyranny is a powerful reminder of the human spirit's enduring strength. Shops and the city's beloved festivals returned, filling the streets with music and laughter. It felt like the city had finally awakened from a 4-year nightmare, realizing that the beauty and learning it had lost could be rebuilt. Yet the scars from Savonarola's reign lingered. Families who had been torn apart by accusations found it difficult to rebuild trust, while artists who had burned their own creations out of religious fervor mourned their lost work. The children who had once enforced the friar's rules carried emotional wounds that would last a lifetime. Florence discovered that civilization, no matter how advanced, remains fragile when faced with organized fanaticism. The lessons from Savonarola's rise and fall continued to echo throughout European history. His challenge to papal authority laid the groundwork for the Protestant Reformation, which would split Christianity just 20 years later. By using popular religious fervor to take political power, he set a precedent for future revolutionaries and demagogues. His destruction of art and knowledge showed how quickly cultural achievements could be erased by those who fear them. Perhaps the most significant takeaway from Savonarola's story is that the price of freedom requires constant vigilance. The Florentines who endured his rule learned that once liberty is lost, it is far harder to regain than to protect. They realized that the very qualities that make a society thrive, its tolerance, openness to new ideas, and trust in human goodness, can also make it susceptible to those who would exploit these traits for personal gain. Even though Savonarola's ashes were scattered in the Arno River 5 centuries ago, the lessons of his life and death remain pertinent for every generation that values freedom over security, tolerance over dogma, and beauty over ideology. His story serves as both a warning and an inspiration. It warns us of how swiftly civilization can fall into chaos when good people allow fear to overshadow reason. At the same time, it inspires those who believe that no matter how powerful tyranny appears, it cannot ultimately triumph over the human longing for truth, beauty, and freedom. In the end, Savonarola's legacy is not the theocracy he attempted to create or the terror he instigated, but rather the Renaissance that followed. After his passing, the art he wanted to eliminate transformed into even more remarkable creations. The knowledge he tried to stifle eventually laid the groundwork for centuries of advancement. The spirit he attempted to extinguish soared from the aftermath of his execution, leading to a world that is fuller of beauty and freedom than he ever envisioned. This outcome might be the most fitting consequence for someone who thought human nature was too flawed to experience joy, beauty, or the freedom to shape its own future.